All right, hello everybody, and now we're going to move right on into week 9, in which we're going to be talking about the respiratory system. So this first lecture, actually the first few lectures, we're just going to go through all the different organs of the respiratory system and then describe them, and then in the last couple lectures we'll actually go through the mechanics and the physiology that underlies respiration, breathing. Okay, so let's just dive right in. The primary function of the respiratory system, not a big surprise, is respiration. But really, we need to be able to break respiration down into multiple ideas. First of all, respiration, the first stage of respiration is pulmonary ventilation. In other words, breathing. This is the movement of air in and out of your lungs, the exchange of air between your lungs and the atmosphere that surrounds you. Step 2 is external respiration, in which oxygen moves from the lungs to the blood and carbon dioxide moves from the blood to the lungs. This is the exchange that takes place between the circulatory system and the respiratory system at the alveoli. Once the oxygen or the carbon dioxide gets into the bloodstream, we have to have transportation of respiratory gases. So this is the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide through the circulatory system. So in other words, oxygen, you want to move it to the tissues of the body so that they can take the oxygen and use it for ATP synthesis, and carbon dioxide can be taken away from the tissues of the body and then sent to hopefully the lungs. Part 4 is internal respiration. Internal respiration is the movement of oxygen from blood to the tissues of the body and carbon dioxide from tissues into the blood. So where we're at right now, again, the gas is inhaled or exhaled. So there's an exchange of gas between our lungs and the atmosphere. This is pulmonary ventilation. We move the oxygen from the lungs to the blood and carbon dioxide from the blood to the lungs. Then we move the oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout the circulatory system. And then 4, you have the movement of oxygen from the blood to the tissues of the body and carbon dioxide from the tissues into the blood. And then finally, 5 is cellular respiration, which we all know and love, right? Cellular respiration is the use of oxygen and some sort of complex carbon-containing molecule to be sequentially oxidized in the mitochondria to generate ATP. So cellular respiration is the process that makes ATP. And the reason it's relevant to this mitochondrial respiration is because it consumes oxygen. This is why the tissues need oxygen, is because they need it for cellular respiration. And then it also allows for them to produce carbon dioxide. Remember, carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product of cellular respiration. So that's it. This is the purpose of the respiratory system, 5 different stages of respiration. And we already covered the cellular respiration piece, but now we're going to talk about the first 4. Of course, respiration is the primary function of the respiratory system, but there are actually a number of other important functions as well. The respiratory system is intimately associated with your regulation of blood pH. This is something that will be covered in detail in later in this lecture or this week's lecture, and it will also be a very prominent feature in Biology 1260. It has to do with carbon dioxide being incorporated into carbonic acid through that formula I showed you a couple of weeks ago. Another function of the respiratory system is smell. The act of bringing air into the nose, into the nasal cavity. We have our olfactory receptors in the nasal cavity and they are able there to identify certain smells. And again, that'll be something that gets covered in 1260 as well. Third, we have filtration of inspired air. So as the air is going particularly through your nose, it's passed through a series of filter-like structures that help get rid of dust and other particles, microbes, for example, that may also be present within the air. So by the time the oxygen or whatever the gas that you're inhaling reaches the lungs, it should be pretty clean. It should be pretty well filtered. We also use our respiratory system for the production of vocal sounds. When we talk about the larynx later, I'll briefly touch on it. It's not a major part of this course, but the larynx is certainly involved in the production of vocal sounds. And then finally, excretion of water and heat in small amounts as well. So the act of breathing, you are eliminating water from your body. In fact, for those of you who are watching or know about the coronavirus story, you'll know that one of the ways it transfers is through water droplets. So if you're infected and you're just through your regular breathing, you're going to be releasing this very small amount of aerosols, water droplets that may contain, in this case, unfortunately the virus. Also, heat leaves your body through your respiratory system as well. So there's some additional functions, but really we're going to be largely focusing on just the respiration in this course. But please be aware of these, and they will, as I say, be things that get examined again in Biology 1260. So there's a couple ways to divide up the geography of the respiratory system. The first way to do it is by structurally dividing the respiratory system into an upper respiratory system and a lower respiratory system. The upper respiratory system, or the upper respiratory tract, contains the nose, the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, the pharynx. Everything else belongs to the lower respiratory tract. So this will include the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and the lungs. So we talk about that as well when we're dealing with infectious disease. So for example, the common cold is an upper respiratory tract disorder. It tends to affect the upper regions of your throat and your nasal cavity in particular. Things like COVID-19 and influenza virus tend to affect the lower respiratory tract. That's why they are impacting the lungs so severely in many unfortunate cases. So that's the first way to break apart the respiratory system, structurally divided into an upper respiratory system and a lower respiratory system. So basically everything above the larynx is upper respiratory system. The larynx and everything below it is the lower respiratory system. You can also functionally divide the respiratory system into two groups. One is the conducting zone. The conducting zone is like this network of interconnecting cavities and tubes outside and inside the lungs. So basically this is the purpose of the conducting system is to bring the air that you breathe in to the respiratory zone. So all the tubes of your respiratory tract, starting with the nose, then into the nasal cavity, then into the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchioles. Those are all part of the conduction system. The conducting zone functions, as I said already, to transport the air into the points of gas exchange in the alveoli of the lungs, but also helps to filter air. It helps to warm air, and it helps to moisten air. And we're going to give you some examples of this as we go through it. The respiratory zone, on the other hand, is where gas exchange occurs. So this is only within the lungs, and it only involves the tubes and tissues in the lungs where gas exchange occurs. And the ones that are included there are respiratory bronchioles, like right here, alveolar ducts, and then the alveolar sacs, and then finally the alveoli as well. And we'll look at each of those specific structures in an upcoming mini lecture. So that's the second way you divide the respiratory zone into the tubes that are responsible for the transport, moistening, warming, and filtration of the air as you breathe it in, and the respiratory zone, which is actually involved in exchange of the air, the oxygen and the carbon dioxide between the air and your bloodstream. So this is where gas exchange is taking place. So let's just start and work our way through the respiratory system. We're going to start as superior as we possibly can, and we're going to start with the nose and then work our way down to the lungs. Okay? The nose is the organ, of course, at the entrance to the respiratory system. It's broken up into two parts. The external nose, and then there's also an internal nose that we'll talk about later. This slide is showing you the external nose. The external nose represents the framework of the nose, the actual part of the nose that's sticking out. And it's covered with muscle and skin, and it's broken up into two parts. First is the bony framework, which consists of the frontal bone, your forehead, the nasal bone, and the maxilla right there. So nasal bone, maxilla, frontal bone, that frames your nose with bone. The second part of the external nose is called the cartilaginous framework. So this is made out of hyaline cartilage. It's made up of septal cartilage, which is running right down the middle of your nose, and then you have lateral nasal cartilage on either side, and that forms collectively the nostrils, which are known as the external nares. At the end of the cartilaginous framework is a network of dense fibrous connective tissue. Right here, an adipose tissue, which is why it has this yellow sheen to it. You can actually palpate them. You can touch the sides of your nostrils, and you can see that it's actually not cartilage or bone. It's actually just dense connective tissue and fat, basically. Now we zoom in and we look at the second part of the nose, which is the internal nose. This is also known as the nasal cavity, and that's what I'm going to primarily be referring to it as. And it has three functions. One is the warming, moistening, and filtering of incoming air. 2 is the detection of olfactory stimuli. And 3 is the modification of speech behaviors. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about part 1 in this class. I'm going to talk a little bit about part 2 in this class, but it will be covered in huge detail in 1260. And 3, we're not going to cover in this class because I'm not doing speech and vocalizations in this class, but you do know that speech is altered by nasal activity because your voice resonates in your nose. So, like, for example, I can go like this, and then suddenly my voice changes completely because the resonation in my nose has now been shut off. We've all done that since we're children, right? So obviously there's a connection between the nose and speech. So, and also when you're stuffed up from a cold or whatever, your voice changes a little bit. So let's look at the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is basically framed by the skeletal framework, which is formed by the nasal bone right here, the frontal bone right here, the ethmoid bone right here, and then the sphenoid bone in the back posteriorly in the vertebral canal. So this is the bony framework. We can focus on the maxilla at the inferior levels. At the anterior, it's the nasal bone and the external nose. At the superior, it's the frontal bone and the ethmoid bone. In the posterior, it's the sphenoid bone and the vertebrae. And that is what frames your nasal cavity, your internal nose. So one point that I want to highlight right away is this region called the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. You can see how there's some spaces within the bone. That's why it's called a cribriform plate. This is where your organ of smell is located. It's found on the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, so it's at the superior top of your nasal cavity. So when you breathe, the basic idea here is that the air is going to enter into your nostrils. It's going to enter into the nasal cavity. You can't see it because this is a sagittal plane or parasagittal plane right now. But the nasal cavity is split into 2 chambers. There's a midline nasal septum, and there's a bone called the vomer bone, which I'll try to remember to show you when I show you one of the actual pictures of a skeleton later on. Just superior to the nostrils, so that's where the nose air enters into the nose, is the nasal vestibule. This is lined with skin containing sweat glands and hair follicles. Collectively, these serve actually kind of an innate immune function because they help filter the air that's being breathed in. And remember, the sweat is hyperosmotic. The hair follicles, so that's bad for bacteria. The hair follicles are actually acting as literal filtration devices. And then it's got skin in there, which, as we've already talked about in this course, is pretty protective. So we have a stratified squamous epithelium at the start of the nostril and the nasal vestibule, but the remainder of the nasal cavity is going to be a mucosa, mucous membrane, and I'll go into describing that in quite a bit of detail in the next mini lecture. So now you have the nasal vestibule. Then we have the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity, as you can see here, has these 3 shelves of tissue. These are called the nasal conchae. There's the superior one, there's the middle one, and then there's the inferior one. These shelves of bone, these nasal conchae, that are lined with skin and ciliated, ciliated mucosal membranes. These are very heavily vascularized. I know everybody's going to deny it, but of course we've all picked our nose at one point. And you know that when you pick your nose, you are putting yourself at risk for a nosebleed. And the reason you're at risk for a nosebleed is because the tissue here is very vulnerable. It's supposed to be in contact with air. It's not supposed to be in contact with your fingers. And as a second point, it's supposed to be in contact with air, and it's also supposed to warm the air, so it's heavily vascularized. So any sort of break in that epithelium is going to cause quite a bit of bleeding. And I'm sure we've all had a pretty major nosebleed in our life. There's these little spaces. The key to these conchae, they're just, like I said, shelving. But you notice that there's these little spaces between them. Those are what we call nasal meatuses. And that's the spaces through which the air is going to flow. The basic idea with these three nasal concha is to split up the air into those three tiny little pathways between them. This maximizes the contact that the air will have with the vascularized tissue that's on the surface of these bones. This will help to warm the air. Secondly, in addition to warming the air, by having to pass the air through such a small space, you're also acting as a means of filtration. This is a way of filtering air and ways to keep large particles out of the air. And also, because there's mucus, this is a mucous membrane, this is producing mucus, the air will also help to get moistened as it gets passed through there. So we really are looking, because of these nasal meatuses that are found in between the nasal conchae, the superior, the middle, and the inferior nasal conchae, we are warming the air by running a lot of vasculature through here. We are filtering the air by forcing the air to go through these tiny spaces. And we're moistening the air thanks to the mucus that's present in this region. This is what this looks like in real life. So this is a dissected human head. And I just want you to see, again, you can see the nose over here, but I just want to focus on these three shelving units. The superior nasal concha, the middle nasal concha, and the inferior nasal concha. And you can see the three meatuses, the nasal meatuses that are in between them. This is what the air has to pass through on its way to your lungs, or at least on its way to your pharynx. So that's a pretty gruesome picture. I'm going to show you another one. This is actually looking at the tissue has been taken away except for the bone here. And now we're looking at a frontal section of the human skull. So we're just cutting in the front here so you can take a look at the nose. Here's the vomer bone running right down the middle. And you can see that it separates the nasal cavity into a right side and a left side. And here you can see the three conchae. So you've got superior concha right here, you've got middle concha right there, and you've got inferior, sorry, the label was left there, but there's inferior concha right there. And look at the tiny spaces that the air has to go through in between these three structures. It's very, very tiny. And don't forget, this picture right here, the tissue has been removed. So there would actually be vascularized tissue on the surface of this bone. So there would be even less space for the air to move through. When we talk about the nasal cavity, we have to talk about the tissues. As I already did mention this, but I want to make sure that I've got it in written form as well. The nasal vestibule is the region immediately superior to the nostrils. It's lined with skin, so stratified squamous epithelium. And just like our skin, it has sebaceous glands to produce oil, low pH material to make the skin more pliable and also fight off microorganisms. The skin here has sweat glands, so you can sweat inside your nostrils. That's going to create a hyperosmotic environment, which will help moisten air, but also at the same time make it unpleasant for microorganisms. And then we have hair follicles, which can help even further filter the nostrils. Collectively here, the function of this region of the body is to fight off infection and filter out particles from the air that we breathe, at least the air that we breathe through our nose. So the other major cell type of the nasal cavity, now that we actually get into the meat of the nasal cavity, is I'm going to focus on the ethmoid bone here. And remember I said that the organ of smell is found in on the ethmoid bone. And here you can see it right here. So this is the ethmoid bone. You can see the spaces between it that are carrying neurons that will carry the information of smell to the appropriate region of the cerebral cortex. And then down here, facing the inside of the nasal cavity, is something called the olfactory epithelium. And the olfactory epithelium is your organ of smell. So the air that's coming through your nose like this is going to go just underneath the respiratory or olfactory epithelium. You can see it's a simple columnar epithelium, actually maybe pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And these cells in yellow here are the cells that are actually responsible for detecting smells. These are called olfactory receptor cells, and they have little cilia that are projecting into the nasal cavity, and you can see that they're embedded in the basically the mucus of the nasal cavity. I won't talk about the other cell types that are present here because that's more of a story that we'll talk about in Biology 1260, but I did want you to be aware that the nasal cavity, the superior-most point of the nasal cavity, which is corresponding to the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, has this olfactory epithelium, which has specialized cells that is responsible for how you detect smell. Another type of cell that you'll find in the nasal cavity, predominantly, actually the vast majority of it, are respiratory mucosa. And you should get used to saying this as comfortably as you can. I want you to be able to say this out loud, maybe even pause the video after I say it. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium with mucus. These are cells that have cilia on their surface. The purpose of the cilia are like those tails at the end of sperm, except they're much smaller and usually much more numerous. Cilia basically beat in unison with one another, and they create this movement. Basically, mucus and particles and debris, anything that's on the in your that's filtered out in your respiratory tract, is going to get crowd surfed by the cilia, and the cilia are always beating in the direction of your digestive system. So all of the garbage that gets filtered out of your air gets trapped in the mucus. The mucus lines up on the surface of these pseudostratified ciliated columnar cells. And as a result of that, they get trapped in this cilia beating that perpetually sends the mucus and the debris and any pathogens that might be present perpetually to your to your digestive system, so that you can ultimately just poop them out. So this is a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia with motile cilia that are pushing mucus into the digestive system. This is just to point out, the cilia are temperature sensitive, so when our noses get really cold, the cilia don't beat as frequently, so the crowd surfing gets a little bit more mundane, and it causes the mucus to actually not be able to make it into your digestive system. Instead, it will try to go back the other way, which is why when things are cold, you tend to get a runny nose. So that's the majority of the cells here. In the really dark cell in this histology, I'm sorry for the bad picture, is a goblet cell. A goblet cell is a specialized cell found in an epithelium that's responsible for secreting mucus and watery fluid. Within this mucus and watery fluid is a series of proteins called lysozymes and defensins. Lysozymes and defensins are the natural antibiotics that our body makes, and it's very successful at killing off most bacteria. So you actually have this innately on the surface of your respiratory tract is cells producing lysozyme and defensin to fight off microorganisms. What's not shown in this picture is that the respiratory mucosa are heavily innervated, and that's why if you get large enough particles in your nasal cavity, they can stimulate these nerves, which would be embedded at the base of this epithelium here. And that's what causes your sneeze reflex. So just as another means of filtration, I guess. The other thing I want to emphasize, although I've mentioned it a couple times, is that this tissue is heavily vascularized. The primary function of this vascularization is not nutrient and waste exchange, but rather to maximize the heat of the tissue to warm the air as it enters deeper and deeper into your body. This is, again, why nosebleeds are much more common. This type of tissue, the nasal cavity, is much more susceptible to bleeding than other regions of your body, simply because this is such a vascularized tissue and such a thin layer of tissue as well. Okay, that's the end of the first lecture on the respiratory system. What I'd like you to be able to do after completing this mini lecture is to be able to, first of all, define respiration, identify those 5 steps of respiration, starting with pulmonary ventilation and working all the way down to cellular respiration. I would like you to be able to describe the functions of the respiratory system. So not just respiration, but also those other things like moistening and warming and filtering the air, changing your voice, making you be able to smell, that sort of thing. Be able to identify the major compartments of the respiratory tract, so structurally and functionally. Structurally, they're broken up into the upper and lower respiratory tracts. Functionally, they're broken up into the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. You should be able to clearly distinguish between all of those regions. And then you should be able to describe the anatomy of the external nose and also the nasal cavity, i.e. the internal nose, which I realize I just doubled up here. So you should know all the cell types and follow basically the level of detail that I showed you in this lecture. All right, I'll see you soon.